All right, welcome to the deep dive. You know how this works, right? We take a single topic, gather a whole bunch of really interesting material on it, and then we, distill it down to the core ideas just for you. Today's a bit unique, though. We're kind of tailoring this one specifically for you, our listener. We know you're coming at this with a philosopher's perspective, and you've got some serious questions about democracy. So think of this as like your own personal deep dive, guided by us through some of the denser philosophical ideas about it.
Yeah, absolutely. You've come to us with this philosopher's curiosity about democracy, and we dove headfirst into the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on it. And I gotta say, it's just amazing how interdisciplinary democracy is. I mean, normative democratic theory, that's what we'll be mostly focusing on. It doesn't exist in isolation, you know? It pulls insights from political science, sociology, psychology, even economics gets in on the action. It's a whole web of different ideas.
Okay, so before we get lost in that web, let's lay out the path we're going to take. There are 7 big questions, kind of central to how philosophers think about democracy, and those are what we'll be focusing on today. First off, the basics, right? How do we even define democracy in a way that makes sense to a philosopher? Then, the really meaty stuff, like what are the arguments for its moral value? And of course, we got to look at the arguments against it, too. After that, we'll tackle the whole concept of democratic authority, like why should citizens feel obligated to obey decisions they might not agree with? Then we'll look at the demands of participation on individuals, especially in these massive democracies we have. We'll untangle the whole idea of representation, and then we'll wade into social choice theory that gets pretty dense. And last but not least, the big one. Who exactly are the people in a democracy? So yeah, quite the philosophical journey ahead of us.
It is. So let's start with that foundational question, the one philosopher's always got to ask. What is democracy? The entry gives us this core definition. It's basically a method for making decisions as a group, and what makes it special is a certain kind of equality among those taking part at a really crucial stage.
Okay, a certain kind of equality. That definitely sounds like there's more to it than meets the eye. What are the essential parts of this definition that a philosopher should really be paying attention to?
Well, there are 4 main things to keep in mind. First, it's all about making decisions collectively. It's about a whole group making choices that everyone in that group has to follow. Second, this definition is intentionally pretty broad. It can apply to all kinds of groups, a family figuring out what to eat, an organization making plans, a whole country choosing its leaders. It even works with different voting systems. Third, and this is really important for philosophers, the definition itself doesn't have any judgment attached to it, morally speaking. Something can be democratic without necessarily being good or just.
So just calling something democratic doesn't automatically mean philosophers are going to give it a thumbs up, right?
Exactly. And then the fourth thing is that this kind of equality we were talking about, well, it can look really different in different situations. It could be as simple as one person, one vote, or it could mean something much deeper, like everyone having a real equal chance to be heard and influence things. The point is, the definition just gives us the general framework. It's normative democratic theory that steps in to figure out which forms of democracy are morally good and when and how they should work.
That's a perfect segue into the really fundamental philosophical question here. Why would any society choose democracy over all the other ways to govern themselves? What makes it a morally good system?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? The entry makes a distinction between the justification of democracy, the moral reasons for having it, and its authority, why we might have a duty to follow decisions made democratically. Let's start with the justifications. There are 2 main types, as I see it. Instrumental and non-instrumental. It's kind of like, is democracy good because of the results it gets, or is it good just in and of itself?
So instrumental meaning we judge it by what it achieves comparing it to other systems.
Right. Instrumental justifications are all about consequences. There are a bunch of arguments in favor of democracy from this angle. One really important set are the responsiveness theories. Basically, they say democracy is better at protecting people's rights and interests because, well, when people in power need your vote to stay in power, they're more likely to actually care what you think, you know?
Yeah.
The entry talks about some great examples, like the real improvements that happened for African Americans when they finally got the right to vote. And there's a ton of evidence that democratic countries tend to do better when it comes to basic rights and freedoms.
Yeah, I mean, if a leader wants you to vote for them, they better listen to what you want.
Exactly. Then there's another big instrumental argument, and it's all about knowledge. It's called the epistemic argument. The idea is that democracy can be a pretty reliable way to get to the right answers, politically speaking. A lot of this thinking comes from something called Condorcet's jury theorem. In simple terms, it says that if you have a big group of people and each person is even slightly more likely to be right than wrong about something, and they all vote independently, the chances of the majority getting it right goes way up as the group gets bigger.
I mean, that's interesting, but like, as a philosopher, I can't help but think about all the assumptions that are built into that theorem. Independent voters, everyone being more likely to be right than wrong. Real-world politics just isn't that neat and tidy.
You're absolutely right. Critics of this theorem point out that in the real world, people don't form opinions in a vacuum. We talk to each other, we argue, we're influenced by the news and social media. Plus, not everyone has access to the same information, and we all have our biases. So yeah, the simple math of the theorem doesn't always perfectly match up with how messy political decisions actually get made. But some theorists have been working on versions of the theorem that loosen some of those strict assumptions.
But I'm guessing the epistemic case for democracy doesn't completely depend on this one theorem, right?
Not at all. There's this really powerful argument about cognitive diversity. The idea is that when you get a wide range of perspectives together, even if no one is an expert on everything, you're more likely to solve problems better. Like, think about a team of researchers from different backgrounds tackling a tough question. Different viewpoints can help spot blind spots and come up with more creative solutions. There's even some research showing that diversity can actually be more important than individual ability in certain cases. And on top of that, people argue that democracy is just better at gathering information about what people need and want and understanding how policies will actually affect people's lives.
So it's not just about getting to some abstract truth, but about understanding the real lived experiences of the people who are going to be affected by the decisions. Right.
Exactly. And it's not just about policies and outcomes. There are instrumental arguments that say participating in democracy is actually good for people, that it can make them better citizens. It can help them be more autonomous because they have a say in how things are run. It can make them more rational because they have to think through different viewpoints. It can make them more engaged with their community. And some even say it can even make them more moral, because they have to think about the common good. Some people argue that all these good effects on individuals can actually lead to better and more just laws being made.
That's a pretty optimistic view of political participation. But I'm sure philosophers haven't always been so positive about democracy. What are some of the instrumental arguments against it?
Oh, there are definitely some strong counter-arguments. I mean, Plato, probably the most famous critic of democracy, argued that giving power to the masses would just lead to bad decisions because most people don't have the wisdom and knowledge to rule well. He thought the ideal rulers would be philosopher kings, super smart and virtuous individuals. You see some of these same ideas today in arguments for epistocracy, rule by the knowledgeable. Even John Stuart Mill, who was a big supporter of representative government, thought there should be a system of plural voting, where people with more education would get more votes.
But then you run into the problem of deciding who gets to say what counts as expertise, and there's a real danger of bias and excluding people, right?
Right. And then you have thinkers like Hobbes who are afraid that democracy would just lead to chaos and instability, with everyone fighting for power and politicians manipulating people to get ahead. We hear similar worries today about things like people being politically uninformed, not caring about politics, and engaging in motivated reasoning, where they only pay attention to information that supports what they already believe. Some scholars are even saying these problems are so bad that we should either abandon democracy or at least change it a lot.
So there's a real back and forth when it comes to the actual practical value of democracy. What about the other side? The non-instrumental justifications, the arguments that say democracy might be good for reasons that go beyond its consequences?
Right. Non-instrumental justifications say that some ways of making decisions are morally right, regardless of the outcome. One big argument here is all about liberty. The idea is that people should be in control of their own lives. And because our lives are so affected by the social and political world around us, having a voice in shaping that world is seen as crucial for self-government, both individually and as a society.
But the entry points out that you take that logic all the way. You need everyone to agree completely on every decision to truly respect everyone's self-governance. And that's just not going to happen in most situations.
That's true. Some philosophers try to work around this, like by arguing for a kind of collective right to self-determination, where the whole community has the right to govern itself democratically. But even then, some say that democratic institutions might be a good way, but not the only way, to achieve this right.
Another big non-instrumental justification is the idea of democracy as public justification. This seems to emphasize the importance of reasons and dialogue in how decisions are made. Right.
That's exactly it. This idea, which draws on people like Habermas and Rawls, says that laws and policies are legitimate only if they can be justified to all citizens through open and reasoned debate. It's about creating rules based on reasons that everyone can accept. Habermas even talks about a two-track model where you have both formal institutions and a more informal public sphere where this justification happens.
But I mean, reaching real agreement in a society where people disagree about so much seems incredibly difficult.
Oh, it's a huge challenge, philosophically speaking. Some theorists think that weaker forms of agreement, like maybe just agreeing on what counts as a good reason in the public debate, might be enough. Rawls has this idea of an overlapping consensus where people can agree on certain basic principles of justice, even if their whole moral and philosophical worldviews are totally different. But critics like Cristiano still aren't sure that these approaches can completely get around the need for a deeper level of agreement.
And then, of course, we have the non-instrumental argument based on equality, which
Yep.
feels like it's the very heart of democracy.
Absolutely. One way to understand this is that when people have big disagreements about how to live together, democracy is a way to treat everyone as equals by giving them an equal say in the decision-making. It's seen as a morally right way to reach a peaceful and fair compromise. The entry also talks about democracy being based on something called public equality, the idea that democratic institutions are the best way to show people that they're being treated as equals when it comes to making decisions together, even though everyone is fallible. This view also suggests that democracy itself has to have some limits. For example, a truly democratic process shouldn't be able to get rid of the basic democratic rights that public equality depends on.
But there's that nagging question of whether majority rule can actually marginalize minorities and go against public equality. And is political equality even really possible in these huge and complex modern states?
Those are some of the toughest questions that democratic theory is still wrestling with. The problem of persistent minorities is definitely a potential conflict with the ideal of public equality. The idea of relational equality, the idea that social relationships shouldn't be based on arbitrary hierarchies of power, offers another way to think about the egalitarian core of democracy. Some philosophers think democratic institutions are really important for this kind of equality because they help spread political power more evenly and prevent certain people or groups from having too much influence.
Okay, so we've covered the moral reasons why democracy might be a good system. But that leads us to the question of its authority, right? Why does a democratic decision create an obligation to follow it, even if you personally disagree with the outcome?
That's a great transition. We're moving now from justification to the concept of democratic authority, which is a bit different. The entry talks about both instrumentalist and intrinsic views of authority.
So instrumentalist authority would be like saying, we should obey democracy because it usually leads to good outcomes.
Exactly. The epistemic approach, which you might remember from our talk about the jury theorem, says that the majority is probably right, so we have a reason to follow their decision. But, as Gooden points out, this can be seen as saying that disagreeing is bad, not just disobeying, but even thinking differently. Estlund has this idea called epistemic proceduralism, which is a bit more nuanced. He says democratic procedures are authoritative because they're better than random decision-making, and they're the best option that everyone can reasonably agree to. So it combines the idea of good outcomes with the idea of public justification.
So it's not just about getting the right answer. It's about getting to it through a process that everyone sees as legitimate. What about the intrinsic views of democratic authority? The ones that say democracy is authoritative just by its very nature.
Those views often focus on the concept of collective self-rule. Locke, for example, thought that when people agree to live in a political society, they're also agreeing to follow the will of the majority because that's the natural way for a group to act when there are disagreements. Rousseau's idea of the general will is another key concept here. Some people think that when democratic deliberation and decision-making are done right, they actually create the general will. Others think these procedures are a way to discover the common good.
And there's also the connection between freedom and authority in democracy. Some theorists, like Stills, say that following democratically made laws, which are supposed to represent the general will, isn't like submitting to someone else's will, but rather following a will that comes from and applies to everyone in the community. But, as the entry points out, there's always the worry that even in a democracy, laws can be imposed on people who don't agree with them.
Exactly. And then you have arguments for democratic authority that are based on equality. Cristiano argues that refusing to follow democratic decisions means you're treating your fellow citizens as if they're less than you, because democracy is all about public equality, everyone having an equal say. Vihov ties this to the idea of relational equality, saying that following egalitarian democratic procedures allows us to cooperate without anyone being forced to submit to someone else's power. And Peter talks about pure epistemic proceduralism, where the authority comes from how fair and reliable the process of making the decision was, not necessarily from whether the decision itself is objectively right.
This all raises a really important question for the philosopher. Does the authority of democracy have any limits? Can a majority just decide to do whatever they want, even if it's morally wrong?
The entry makes a distinction between internal and external limits. Internal limits come from the very principles or processes that give democracy its authority or justification. For example, the idea that democracy can't be used to destroy the basic political rights that are needed for democracy to work in the first place. Locke believed that people can't consent to be ruled arbitrarily or to have their fundamental rights taken away, so there are limits to what democratic authority can legitimately do. Dworkin connects this to the idea of treating all citizens as equal members of the community, which implies that they have rights to equal treatment and respect for their moral independence. Cristiano, with his focus on public equality, suggests that democracy shouldn't violate that same public equality. So this could mean there are limits on what the majority can decide when it comes to things like basic freedoms and economic rights.
And the problem of persistent minorities, where certain groups are constantly outvoted, could also be seen as an internal limit, because it might go against the fundamental idea of public equality.
Exactly. External limits, on the other hand, come from moral values or principles that exist outside of the specific democratic process. Things like fundamental human rights, or, as Locke argued, natural property rights. The entry gives the example of a democratic decision to go to war, which some citizens might see as deeply morally wrong. In those cases, the external moral considerations might be stronger than the general duty to follow a democratic decision. Some philosophers think there are only external limits, while others argue for a combination of both internal and external ones. Decisions about foreign policy often bring up these complex questions about external limits.
So shifting gears a bit, let's talk about the individual's role in all of this. What are the demands on citizens in a large-scale democracy? How much participation is expected or even morally required?
This is one of the biggest debates in democratic theory. The entry starts by talking about the problem of democratic participation. It's kind of like Plato's idea that you need knowledgeable rulers because modern governments are so complicated. And there's also the reality that people have to work and live their lives. How much time and energy can they actually put into staying informed about politics and participating? Then there's the famous paradox of voting. In a big election, your individual vote almost certainly won't change the outcome, so why bother getting informed or even voting at all?
Right, the rational apathy argument. The costs of participation seem to outweigh the benefits for any individual. This seems to be a big problem for the more idealistic visions of democracy that need active and informed citizens.
Exactly. And this is especially a problem for theories like egalitarian and deliberative democracy, which depend on people being smart and engaged to work. The entry goes on to explore different solutions to this problem, or at least different ways of thinking about it. Elite theory says that when too many citizens participate, you actually get worse policies, so some apathy might be good. They think elites should take care of governing, and citizens should just choose which elites they want in charge. Interest group pluralism is a different model. They see democracy as a bunch of different minority groups with specific interests connected to their daily lives, bargaining and negotiating with each other.
And then there's the neoliberal view, which doesn't really trust either elites or organized groups. They want to shrink the government as much as possible so there's less demand on citizens, and they favor individual freedom and market-based solutions.
Yep. And Somon's argument for decentralizing things so people can vote with their feet by moving to places with governments they like better kind of fits in with that idea too. But the entry makes the point that a lot of these theories assume that people are mainly acting out of self-interest. If we think about motivations like wanting to help others, feeling a sense of duty, or caring about the common good, then maybe participating makes more sense. Deliberative democracy is all about how these broader concerns can develop through real public discussion.
Which brings us to the idea of a division of democratic labor, where different parts of society contribute to the overall workings of the system. But that immediately leads to the question, how much should ordinary citizens know, and what kind of judgments should we expect from them?
One idea is that citizens should just choose the big goals for society, and then experts should figure out the details of how to get there. But even this still requires citizens to have some basic understanding of politics so they can vote well and hold their representatives accountable. And there's also the fact that people with more information and resources tend to have more influence, which can be a problem for equality. But citizens do find ways to deal with complex political issues, like relying on sources they trust and using mental shortcuts. They also depend on things like the media, unions, parties, and influential people to get information and make sense of choices. Political parties, in particular, can be really important in connecting people with experts and presenting different perspectives. But the economic inequalities in our society can also create inequalities in who has access to information and who can influence politics. The entry even briefly talks about sortition choosing officials randomly as a possible way to deal with things like political ignorance and elite control, though there are worries about accountability and whether randomly chosen people would have enough expertise or be able to think long term.
Okay, so given all of this, what are the actual moral duties of citizens in a democracy? Is there, like, a moral obligation to vote?
That's a tough one that people argue about a lot. Voting is often seen as a civic duty, but in a huge election, your single vote probably won't make a difference. So is it morally required? Parfit has this utilitarian argument that says if one candidate is much better than the others, then lots of people voting for them will lead to more overall well-being, so we have a moral reason to vote. But some people point out the particularity problem, which is like, why focus on voting when there might be other things you can do that would help people more? Guerrero argues that voting is a duty because it creates a stronger normative mandate for the people in power, though how much your individual vote contributes to that is debatable. Some even say that voting is a duty because it means you're not complicit in the bad things the government does. And Maskafter says it's a duty to do your fair share in making society just, in line with public equality, and that voting is a key part of doing that.
What about when the laws made democratically seem unjust? That brings us to the idea of principled disobedience, right?
Right. Civil disobedience, which is usually defined as breaking a law publicly, nonviolently, and with the aim of changing the law or government policy, while being willing to accept the consequences, is often seen as justified in a democratic society. The justification often comes from the same ideas that support the duty to obey just laws in the first place. If the system is seen as legitimate overall, then civil disobedience might be a way to point out injustices and make things more just and equal. Some philosophers even consider whether more uncivil disobedience, like hiding things from the government or even using violence, could ever be justified in really extreme cases if it seems like the best way to achieve something good. But Simmons raises a really fundamental challenge here. He says if there's no general duty to obey the law, then there's no special reason why you would need to justify breaking it.
So, last but not least, since disagreement is inevitable in democratic societies, what are the moral obligations people have to accommodate those who have different views?
The entry talks about the duties of compromise being willing to accept something less than perfect so you can reach an agreement and move forward, and the duties of public justification giving reasons for your political views that other people could accept even if they disagree with you. Most people agree there are practical reasons to compromise, but whether there are moral reasons is more controversial. And then there's the duty of public justification, like Rawls's idea of the duty of civility. He thought people should appeal to a shared political idea of justice when they talk about politics, because that's necessary for the government to respect everyone's freedom and equality, even if it has to use force sometimes.
One of the most important things about modern democracies is that they're representative. We choose people to make decisions for us. What are the big ethical questions about democratic representation?
There are two main ones that the entry focuses on. First, what's the best system for representation? It talks about the main types: single-member district systems, proportional representation, and systems that represent specific groups, plus combinations of those. Which system is best often depends on how you justify democracy, what you think citizenship means, and practical considerations. For example, some people argue that single-member districts lead to more stable governments, while proportional representation gives minority viewpoints a fairer chance to be heard. And group representation is about making sure historically marginalized groups are included. But each system has its own problems and criticisms.
And the second big ethical question is about the representatives themselves. What do they owe to the people they represent?
This is where that classic distinction between the trustee model and the delegate model comes in, which Pitkin talks about. In the trustee model, representatives are supposed to use their own judgment based on their expertise and the information they have to make what they think are the best decisions, even if it goes against what the people they represent might want at that moment. In the delegate model, representatives are basically seen as agents. They're supposed to do exactly what their constituents tell them to do. The entry suggests that maybe the best approach depends on the situation. For example, maybe representatives should act more like delegates when it comes to the big goals of society, but more like trustees when it comes to figuring out how to actually reach those goals.
Okay, we can't talk about democracy without talking about social choice theory, and specifically Arrow's impossibility theorem. This sounds like a real challenge to the whole idea of making democratic decisions.
It definitely raises some tough questions. Basically, what Arrow's theorem says is that it's impossible to create a perfectly fair and consistent way to combine everyone's individual preferences into one big social preference order when there are more than two choices. This throws a wrench into the idea that there's always a clear will of the people that democratic processes can reveal. The entry uses the Condorcet rule to explain this. The problem is that you can have situations where a majority prefers A to B, another majority prefers B to C, and yet another majority prefers C to A, so you end up with a cycle where there's no clear winner.
So even with fair voting rules, the outcome might not reflect a stable or rational collective choice, is that right?
Yeah, that's the main takeaway. Thinkers like Riker have said that this undermines the whole idea of a coherent popular will that guides the government. And there's the fairness critique, which says that if these cycles happen a lot, then the outcomes of democratic decisions might just be the result of strategic maneuvering, not a fair reflection of what people actually want. But there are some counterarguments. Some people aren't convinced that these preference cycles happen that often in the real world. Others say that even if you can't always get a clear winner, democratic procedures can still be fair if everyone has an equal chance to participate and influence things. Ingham talks about political equality in a way that considers how strongly people feel about their preferences, and that's another way to think about fairness, even when there's no obvious majority. It's unlikely that you'd often see a situation where all the majorities in a cycle feel equally strongly about their preferences. So even with cycles, it's possible that things can be fair if the people who care the most get what they want.
And finally, we come to the boundary problem. Who counts as part of the people who get to decide things? This seems especially relevant in today's world where everything is so interconnected.
It's a really important issue that's getting more and more complicated. The entry points out that the traditional idea of the people as just the people living within a particular country doesn't work so well anymore. A lot of decisions made in one country can have big consequences for people in other countries, like with pollution, for example. One idea for drawing boundaries is the principle of national self-determination. This says boundaries should be based on shared culture, history, political norms, and a sense of belonging to a certain place. But this principle is tough to apply consistently in societies that are diverse and globally connected.
And it seems like the democratic ways to solve the boundary problem are kind of circular. Like if we say the people should decide the boundaries, don't we first need to know who the people are? What about the all-subjected principle?
The all-subjected principle says that everyone who is under a particular power or who is affected by a decision should get a say in that decision. That's a good starting point, but it doesn't cover every case of someone being affected by a decision. Think about the pollution example again. People might be harmed by pollution even though they're not directly under the control of the polluter. Then there's the all-affected principle, which says that everyone affected by a decision should have a say. It sounds good, but the entry talks about some serious problems with it, both in theory and in practice. What does having a say even mean? And how much does a decision have to affect you for you to count as affected? If you make the definition too broad, then almost every decision would require including a ridiculous number of people, which would make decision-making impossible and break down social and political life.
So even though the all-affected principle sounds good in theory, it might not be very practical for deciding boundaries. Are there any other approaches that could work better?
The entry suggests that we should focus on creating institutions that give people the power to stand up for their legitimate interests, though that doesn't directly solve the boundary problem. Then there's a more conservative approach, which says we should stick with the existing boundaries unless there's a really good reason to change them. They argue that changing boundaries could lead to conflicts, and there aren't strong enough international institutions to manage those changes. They say that even though existing borders might be kind of arbitrary, states have developed ways of holding people accountable, and they often represent real social groups. Negotiation and international law can help deal with problems that cross borders. This view says that if we do need to change boundaries, it should be in response to serious injustices or situations where minority groups are being constantly excluded.
So as we wrap up this deep dive for our philosophical listener, it's clear that democracy is a really complicated idea with a lot of philosophical challenges that haven't been resolved.
Right.
We've talked about how to define it, the different arguments for and against it, the idea of its authority and its limits, what citizens are expected to do, how representation works, the insights from social choice theory, and the fundamental problem of who gets to be part of the democratic process.
What's really interesting for philosophers is how all these different parts of democratic theory connect with each other. Your understanding of why democracy might be good is going to affect how you see its authority, what you think citizens should do, and even who you think should be included in democracy. It's a rich area of philosophical inquiry that's still going strong.
And to you, our listener, the philosopher who's been thinking about all these tensions within democratic thought, the balance between ideals and reality, between equality and expertise, between individual freedom and collective decisions, between local control and global interconnectedness. What one big question do you think is most important for philosophers to address today as they think about the future of democracy? It's a deep question, and we hope this deep dive has given you a good foundation to keep exploring these ideas. Thanks for joining us.